You should see a link on my Who Gives a Shit Facebook page. The WGAS Chicago.
Hang on. Let's say. Oh, okay. It's live now.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Should I get out of the messenger room? Or?
I don't know. I'm gonna mute this, but
Yeah,
it's the wrong way. Hang on. Let's see here. How this work? Kind of. It'll work enough, maybe. Okay. Can you hear me on the live stream? Thumbs up, down, audio. Okay. Well, welcome to my presentation. I hope you can stick around. It's a little long, but I think it's educational, and we're recording this via Facebook Live. So if you can't stick around for the whole presentation, I'll just close that. So if you can't stick around for the whole video, it'll be around so you can watch it. Let's do this. Cool. So Chicago's Monument to Fascism and the resistance to it. So start off with FDR defining what fascism is for everyone out there who might not know. He said in a message to Congress that the first truth is that the liberty of democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism, ownership of government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling private power. Okay. So, fascism is essentially dictatorship, right? The quote here, fascism should more properly be called corporatism because it is the merger of state and corporate power, from Giovanni Gentile in the Italian Encyclopedia. And that was really kind of highlighted with the way the Italian fascist government operated, which was that it was, essentially if the Chamber of Commerce replaced Parliament. Fascism is death. Fascist generals would use this phrase, long live death. Glamorizes militarism and war. And you would see this Death's Head logo on Nazi SS and other fascist military uniforms. Really sort of glamorizes death and destruction. So a little bit of World War II history for people who might not know some of the Italian portion of the war. In 1922, you had the March on Rome, where Mussolini came to power and establishes the Kingdom of Italy. 1933, Hitler's appointed chancellor comes to power in Germany. 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia. leads to the collapse of the League of Nations. 1939, Germany invades Poland. World War II begins in earnest. 1941, the U.S. enters World War II after Pearl Harbor. July 1943, the Grand Fascist Council partners with King Victor Emmanuel III to overthrow Mussolini. In September of that year, Germany invades Italy, places Mussolini in power as sort of a Nazi puppet to lead the Italian Social Republic. And later in that year, or that same month, the U.S. invades Italy. And by 1945, Mussolini is captured and killed by partisans, anti-fascist guerrillas. So, who was Italo Balbo? As you see here, it's on the cover of Time magazine. Led a unit of fascist black shirts and helped lead the terror that brought Mussolini to power. He was one of the 4 leaders of the March on Rome in 1922. He broke up labor union strikes, and I feel responsible for the assassination of pro-labor Catholic priests like Giovanni Manzoni, who we'll talk about in a minute. In 1926, he helped found and lead the Italian Air Force, which would use chemical weapons in conquering Libya and Ethiopia, often referred to as Mussolini's number 2 for a time. In 1933, he was appointed Governor General and oversaw the Italian occupation of Libya, and died June 28, 1940, in a friendly fire incident. Conspiracy theorists like to say, oh, Mussolini, there's a rift between them. I don't think the facts support that. I think most historians don't support that view. So we have a little bit of information about what he did as a leader of the Black Shirts. In 1921, they invade this Italian area, 4,000 thugs, shooting, beating, killing people for 2 days, enormous devastation, unburied dead in the streets, similar actions around the country. And, as a result of a lot of that black shirt violence, you saw people started organizing against the black shirts. One of them was this Catholic priest, Don Giovanni Manzoni. He was a local consul. He was clubbed to death by 2 black shirts who were under the command of Balbo. Balbo at the time kind of fled to Rome. Then there was a trial that, you can't really expect fascist trials to, really be impartial towards fascist leaders. So he was acquitted. And there's this diary entry from Manzoni's diary. With an open heart, with a prayer for my persecutors that will never disappear from my lips, I await the tempest, the persecution, maybe even death, for the cause of Christ to triumph. And I think that's, really important to highlight that, there were Christians and Catholics that resisted fascism in Italy. And today, in Argenta, there's a statue of Don Manzoni outside, I believe this is a church. And there's even a movie called Beyond the Storm about Manzoni. So you kind of see he's standing up to the fascist tough guys. What a bunch of thugs. So, one of the other parts of Balbo's history was, he was appointed governor of Libya. Italy had originally invaded Libya in 1911. Over time, Libya asserted some independence, but the reconquest, or quote-unquote pacification, took place 1923 to 1932. Key to the Italian victory was their Air Force use of chemical weapons. They would build concentration camps. 12,000 Tunisians executed in 1931. 100,000 forced into these camps, where another 40,000 died. The total Libyan deaths, nearly half of the country, which went from 1.4 million in 1907 to 825,000 in 1933. Truly a genocide, which, even before he was governor, Balbo was responsible for the Air Force and that conquest, and then after he was appointed governor, responsible for continuing a lot of that, persecution. So, part of that, continuing with that when he was governor, was essentially colonizing Libya. Native Libyans were barred from higher education. The Italian colonizers were given vacation homes where, of course, the Libyans would work for them for, cheap. A lot of parallels to Jim Crow here in America. And, there was religious discrimination. Balbo ordered the Jews to work on the Sabbath, on Saturdays, or, face the consequences. In this case, being whipped in public. So this is a photo of one of the concentration camps in Libya. And you hear this from some of the, revisionist historians out there. Oh, well, Balbo, he wasn't as bad as the Nazis. He was critical of Mussolini allying himself with the Nazis. He actually spoke out to help the Jews, right? So, you see this quote here from Dominic DeFrisco and Lou Raga, who, run the Joint Civic Committee of Italian Americans and the Italian American Human Relations Foundation. It was a letter they wrote for the Tribune, Chicago Tribune. When Balbo saw where Mussolini was going with his pro-German policies, Balbo was horrified. He was one of the only fascists in Mussolini's regime to openly oppose Italy's anti-Jewish racial laws and Italy's alliance with Germany. Cool story, bro. 1936, as governor of Libya, he ordered Jews to work on the Sabbath. Those who did not had their business licenses revoked. Protests broke out, and, Cian Barda and Saul Naisi were given 10 strokes of the Kurbash in public. And this is a quote from a letter that Balbo wrote to Mussolini. I did not hesitate to order the public flogging of Jews, even those of high social standing, who are guilty of adopting an attitude of passive indifference to certain official measures. That's an interesting phrasing, too, because it's not just who rebelled or started a riot. Passive indifference was enough to warrant a flogging from Balbo. And in 1938, he helped enforce the Italian anti-Semitic laws, which barred Jews from teaching in state schools, working in municipalities, banks, public institutions, and required Libyan Jews to register their property, barred from getting public contracts or obtaining Italian citizenship. And this is, keep in mind, before Germany had boots on the ground in Libya. the next year. And, I think scholars of the Holocaust will tell you these are some of the first steps towards what leads to, the mass executions, right? You take away people's rights and erode their standing in the community. So, he was a part of that, without a doubt. And in this 1939 letter to Mussolini, Balbo pushed to delay the anti-Semitic laws because, quote, if the Jews suddenly stopped participating in the economy before they could be replaced by a group of Catholic merchant and industrialists, there would be economic imbalances in Libya. So we see here what his goal is. It's not to defend Jewish people. It's to, hey, give me time to raise up some Catholic financial people to take their place, right? So that's the end goal here, and it's frustrating when some of these revisionist historians try to paint it like he was trying to help them out, when clearly he made clear his intents. And if I can go back a little bit, this quote of his, they ought to put this on the base of the column in Chicago, maybe we can project it on there. I did not hesitate to order the public flogging of Jews. Just Italo Balbo, flogger of Jews. So, why does Chicago have a monument to Balbo? Good question. The year was 1933. Chicago held the World's Fair. The theme was A Century of Progress, because Chicago had incorporated in 1833, and so it was held on the centennial of the city. Balbo flew to Chicago as, the head of the Italian Air Force. He led this squadron of 24 seaplanes from Italy. They had this big event. The State Department organized a lunch. Balbo was honored by city leaders like Edward Kelly and given a honorary degree from Loyola University. And he was given a native headdress, as was the fashion at the time. Some pretty embarrassing photos. In return, Balbo delivered this monument as a gift to the city of Chicago. Came from the port of Ostia, which is in modern-day Rome, and it still stands today in Burnham Park, just a little east of Soldier Field, where the Chicago Bears play. And there's this text on the base of it, right? So this kind of base area, it says, "This column, 20 centuries old, erected on the beach of Ostia, port of imperial Rome, to safeguard the fortunes and victories of the Roman triremes, fascist Italy, by command of Benito Mussolini, presents to Chicago exultation symbol memorial of the Atlantic squadron led by Balbo, that with Roman daring flew across the ocean in the 11th year of the fascist era." So, it's a propaganda piece, right? It's talking about connecting imperial Rome to fascist Italy. It's a puff piece. Plaque was also placed on the Columbus Monument, praising Balbo's flight. So, this Columbus statue that's also near Soldier Field. And Chicago renamed 7th Street Balbo Drive. Now, you kind of, these revisionist historians, some of these, Italian pride groups, like to make out that, he was welcomed with open arms, everyone loved him, he gave people a sense of pride, but that's not true, there were protests. People organized against this propagandistic display of fascist lies. In 1933, when Balbo came to Chicago, the Italian Socialist Federation and the Italian League for the Rights of Men demonstrated against the installation of this monument. They airdropped this flyer, right? And this flyer has this great quote: "It is a disgrace that this murderer and terrorist should be received by democratic America as the official representative of the Italian people." So after the war, there were attempts to rename the street too, right? 1946, the VFW, the Illinois Congress of Parents and Teachers, and more campaigned to have the street renamed after Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Waldron led torpedo bombers and died in the Battle of Midway, really changing the course of the battle in the process. The USS Waldron is named after him, and he was played by actor Glenn Corbett in the 1976 film Midway. And there was a citywide debate about this, right? Russell Root, who was a candidate for mayor, said, "Chicago boys of Italian descent who fought in Italy do not wish to honor the fascist who betrayed his own people as well as conducted a war against our country." But it was a difficult fight. Mayor Kelly, who was there when Balbo landed, blocked renaming the street based on that conspiracy theory I mentioned earlier about the rift between Balbo and Mussolini. And Kelly has a history of this sort of a fascist apologism. In 1934, he banned the anti-Nazi film Hitler's Reign of Terror. After protests, he relented and let them show it under just the name Hitler's Reign. But it shows what his initial impulses are, right? Alderman Budinger, who was one of the leaders of the fight to rename it after Waldron, it died in subcommittee. The mayor kind of moved it to subcommittee. However, Waldron did have a street named after him just south of Soldier Field. I guess my image isn't quite working there. 50 years later, in 1983, Chicago Tribune columnist Vernon Jarrett wrote about sort of a 50-year commemoration of this event, of Balbo landing. And he wrote, "It will indeed be tragic if the city of Chicago and its prestigious museum participate in any way with the Balbo anniversary. Such an association in 1983 would offer nothing more than a shocking demonstration that some in high places refuse to learn from history." Refuse to learn from history. And of course, over the years, a lot of black and Latino leaders have been denied monuments and street names in Chicago. In 1933, the Park District refused to erect a statue of Puerto Rican activist Dr. Pedro Albizu Campos in Humboldt Park. And in 2006, the city blocked attempts to have an honorary Fred Hampton Way named after Black Panther leader Fred Hampton. I could do a whole presentation on him. He's an incredible figure. So what do I have to do with this? Okay, Muchowski, not exactly a Italian name. Well, I learned about Balbo from a flyer protesting Columbus Day Parade in 2002. I had just started college, and going to events. They had this flyer called the Start of the Columbus Day Parade at Columbus and Balbo, where colonialism and fascism meet. I was a student at DePaul. I got active in Students Against the War. And in 2005, I was a senior. I participated in one of those Columbus Day protests. And you can see me in the background there, in the red shirt, closest to the police officer. And there's a close-up of my face there. While we were at this parade, we saw Mayor Daley, little Richie, and I shouted, "Why don't you rename Balbo Drive after someone who isn't a fucking fascist?" And that was the police response to cuff me and throw me in the back of the squad car. The charges were dropped. I was written a ticket for misdemeanor disturbing the peace. So kind of a low-level crime, if that. The National Lawyers Guild helped get the ticket thrown out. And, it made me care about this issue, maybe more than most. But there's a new urgency to this, right? We saw after the Charleston church shooting in 2015, there was a push to take down Confederate monuments and racist monuments across the country. A lot of these statues were built decades after the Civil War, part of this lost cause mythology, which coincided with the rise of the Klan and lynchings. And it reached a fever pitch as far as the reaction to this effort to take down the statues with the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017, which was started by these alt-right people to defend a statue of General Robert E. Lee. So the violence that those alt-right people caused accelerated the pace to take down these Confederate monuments even more. So you can see the Durham County Courthouse, activists tied this statue to I believe a pickup truck, and just tore it down. There it goes, crumples like a cheap piece of lies. We saw at UNC Chapel Hill, the Silent Sam statue was covered in fake blood and toppled. And today, with the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests across the country, there's even more of an urgency to take down these racist monuments. So in Birmingham, Alabama, they took down the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. Actually, activists were trying to take it down, and the mayor stepped in and said, "You know what? Let's not get anyone hurt. Let me bring in the cranes and take it down tomorrow." And he did. The Daughters of the Confederacy headquarters in Richmond, Virginia, which they had done a lot to promote this lost cause mythology and build a lot of these statues. Their headquarters was burned. And in Raleigh, North Carolina, this Confederate monument, they made a plaque honoring, activists made a plaque honoring George Floyd and placed that on the base of the statue over the Confederate, language as sort of like an art protest, a re-envisioning of what sort of statues we could have and who we could be honoring, right? You hear all these Confederate revisionists talking about these statues are history. Well, then why don't you support building statues of Harriet Tubman or John Brown or General Sherman or people who actually took action to support the Underground Railroad or abolish slavery in the South? And you see, there's more monuments being taken down. The Southern Poverty Law Center keeps a really great list. It's pretty helpful. Definitely worth consulting. Can quibble over some that they left out in Chicago. These protests against statues have gone international in the last few days and weeks. So we saw statues of Leopold II, the Belgian king who killed millions in the Congo, was painted over, burned, destroyed, removed, and removed by the government, actually, not just protesters. And speaking of protesters taking down monuments, the statue of slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol in the UK was torn down and dumped in the harbor. And that's where Google Maps shows it now, in the harbor. There's also been renewed attention on the myth of Columbus. The graphic there isn't quite working right, but there's this excellent YouTube video, the link there, that talks about how much people believe these myths about Columbus, that in reality he wasn't a good navigator. He brutalized Native people, enslaved them, killed them, and that's led to protests today. This monument in I believe New Jersey, and the mayor has this quote: "The legend of Columbus does not match the history. Today, the man, the statues, the monuments celebrating his life are divisive and a symbol of hate and oppression and cannot remain as part of our community." In Richmond, the statue of Columbus was torn down by protesters and thrown in the water at this park. I think all the memes are joking that Columbus discovers the bottom of the pond. It's not like he really discovered the Americas. And here in Chicago, there's several petitions that have been started to take down the Columbus statue downtown. So here in Chicago, there has been a movement to take down all the Balbo iconography, right? In 2017, several online petitions were formed, collected all together, the different petitions, probably 2,000 signatures. This was the one I made. And this one suggested renaming Balbo, the street, after Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching civil rights activist. And in 2017, there were several rallies at the monument. This Labor Beat video kind of shows some of the people who rallied there. So, like I said, people were pushing this idea of renaming the street after Ida B. Wells. Mayor at the time, Rahm Emanuel, was open to it. And, some of the aldermen whose wards contained the street in it felt pressure from Italian groups, like some of these revisionist groups, to keep the name. And sort of the compromise, if you can call it that, was to rename Congress Avenue after Ida B. Wells, which is great. Ida B. Wells deserves a street like Congress, which is a bigger street, has more traffic, to be named after her. But it's frustrating that they back down on renaming Balbo. And there's a need to rename Balbo and to take down the monument. And I love this picture. It shows an American GI, right after World War II, taking down this Adolf Hitler Street sign and putting up Roosevelt Boulevard, right? And to me, it highlights a simple fact that, our public spaces need to reflect who we are, need to reflect our values, and, when the right side wins the war, you should have that reflected in the public iconography. And Chicago's a progressive city. Balbo does not reflect those values whatsoever. And taking down this monument, renaming the street, would be a lesson in history greater than leaving it up. Leaving it up is ignoring those lessons from history. It's ignoring who he was and whether that reflects our values today. Streets are renamed all the time. It reflects our changing understanding of history and our relationship to it. So, a good example was all the streets named after Dr. King. Chicago was one of the first to do that in 1968, renaming South Parkway. More than 1,000 streets have been renamed after Dr. King. Often, after protest, people demand that a street honor Dr. King, and a lot of times there's tension. It's opposed by business groups or racist groups. Here in Chicago, a lot of history with labor. The Haymarket incident. There's a battle for the 8-hour workday in 1886, and for years, Chicago had this police statue at Haymarket, which was, hang on, which was, very much a symbol of, the police repression, the violence against union activists, and, it was a contentious site. The statue was blown up twice in the 1960s. It was moved to the police HQ, the police training academy, and currently resides at 3510 South State Street. Perhaps a good location for future protests. In its place at the Haymarket Square at Randolph and Des Plaines, in 2004, as a result of the work of the Illinois Labor History Society, they built this monument, which is much more pro-labor, pro-free speech, and there's a gathering every May 1st at this statue, and there are plaques added to the base of it, dedications from labor unions around the world who want to honor, Haymarket and the fight for the 8-hour workday. In Italy, so this effort to rename streets named after fascists, the mayor of Rome said that they shame our country, in particular targeting these two fascists that signed the Race Manifesto. Italy has this law banning reviving the fascist party, and it's expanded it in recent years to curb neo-fascist groups, although there's still a lot of work to be done. One article was really good at explaining some of the different fascist buildings that still remain in Italy and some of the back and forth over them. In Germany, I think a lot of people know about the denazification efforts there. It was written into their constitution We saw the picture. Signs were renamed after the war. The fascist arms salute is banned. Can carry an 8-month prison sentence and several €1,000 fine. The swastika is banned. Until recently, even anti-Nazi media were not allowed to use it. A famous example being this video game Wolfenstein, but records couldn't even have a picture of the swastika with an X through it. Even that was banned. It was to the point where there are these trees in the shape of a swastika that were planted in World War II, and they cut down the trees to prevent it from becoming a gathering spot for neo-Nazi groups. They cut down some, they moved some, replanted them elsewhere. And you see a lot of conservatives talking about, these taking down these Confederate statues is such a blow to history, I don't remember them complaining in 2003 when the statue of Saddam Hussein was taken down. And, the American Revolutionary War, after the Declaration of Independence was signed, New Yorkers tore down a statue of King George III in Manhattan. Which is why no one knows who won the American Revolution. I mean, do you? I don't know, And this article talking about this destruction of this monument says, removing monuments is as much about the people calling for change as it is about the statues themselves. And this wouldn't be the first time that a street named after Balbo was renamed. The Via Balbia, or Littorania Balbo, was a highway built during the Italian occupation, named after Balbo after he died. And after Libyan independence, it was renamed the Libyan Coastal Highway. And you see this picture there of German tanks on the road fighting against the Allies. So, what do we do with this column, right? We could repatriate it to Rome or to Greece. The rock used for the column came from Greece, right? This expert at the Chicago Park District kind of talks about how it was brought to Rome by this emperor who fancied Corinthian architecture. It was probably used at a temple before it was moved to be a part of a fortress at the port. That raises a lot of questions about Roman history as well. But really, the column can be placed in a museum in Chicago, in Rome, in Greece, with a display that properly contextualizes its history. In short, that belongs in a museum. Thank you, Harrison Ford, Steven Spielberg, and Indiana Jones. So what about the street name? I think we need a committee to look at different ideas. A good thing about that is you can come up with a list, and any names that aren't used for renaming that street can go into the docket to be used for other streets around the city. So, a few ideas. Enrico Fermi. He was an Italian who fled fascist Italy to Chicago, researched nuclear energy, and played a part in making sure that the U.S. had nuclear power and not the fascists, not the Axis powers. In 2011, the Chicago Tribune editorial actually supported renaming the street after Fermi. Sacco and Vanzetti. 2 Italian immigrants falsely accused of murder and executed, it would highlight the struggle of Italian immigrants and the parallels to the Italian immigrant experience and that of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think there's a lot there. Don Giovanni Minzoni. You know, I think you see a lot of these revisionists on this topic talk about, oh, well, no one knew how bad fascism was going to be. Well, we saw clearly some did. The people who organized against the black shirts did. The people who protested against Balbo when he visited Chicago did. Naming a street after Minzoni would highlight that, right? It would honor those who knew better. St. Francis Xavier Cabrini. Again, it would highlight Italian immigrant struggles. You have that Chicago connection. Omar al-Mukhtar, who was part of the Libyan resistance to the Italian occupation. He was depicted in the 1981 movie Lion of the Desert. Or Haile Selassie, who was the Ethiopian emperor, resisted the Italian invasion. He was the 1935 Time Man of the Year. And, you know, that would highlight Chicago's history of being a Ethiopian hub, as well as, you know, the site of some of the largest protests against Italy's invasion of Ethiopia at the time. You know, Dr. King. He has a street named after him in Chicago, and he deserves a bigger and better street than what is currently Balbo Drive. But I wanted to kind of point this out, that originally the alderman who put forward the idea of naming a street after Dr. King, Leon Dupre, wanted a street downtown named after Dr. King. And Mayor Daley pushed it to be a street on the south side, which Black Alderman A.A. Sammy Rayner called tokenism. So, you know, something to think about. You know, maybe we could name a street downtown after Dr. King. You know? I hear you. This sounds expensive. Won't it cost money? I thought the name of this presentation was Defunding Fascism. Sounds like you want to spend more money on this. Guess what? It already costs money. The Chicago Department of Transportation maintains the street signs. It can cost about, you know, $1,200 an intersection to replace them with materials and labor. And over the years, as the designs of street signs change, the city has to replace them. So they've gone from black and white street signs to black on yellow, and today it's the white on green. And now they're changing, they're in the process of changing all the street signs from all caps, from all capital letters, to upper and lowercase letters, based on, you know, federal guidance, based on studies showing that people are able to process the street names faster that way. Seems to me like if the city's going to have to replace these street signs to meet this guidance sometime in the future, now would be a great time to rename the street. Save money. Roll it into one. The Park District maintains the Columbus statue and the Roman column. In 2016, there's this restoration project, which was an attempt to fundraise for weather protection, a donor wall. They were going to have plaques installed with a history of the flight. I don't think that really got off the ground, but that was, you know, Park District staff who were working with some of these revisionist groups That's time, that's money for staff, maintenance, efforts at fundraising. All of that is going towards some of these fascist revisionist groups instead of going to Libyan or Ethiopian communities or, Italians who actually read history. And as we've seen, sites like this become gathering spots for bad actors. Charlottesville began when the alt-right wanted to defend this General Lee statue. It can cost the city money to deal with protests. The mayor of Birmingham in Alabama, he was on Good Morning America talking about his decision to tear down the Confederate Monument there. And he said, look, the cost of tearing it down and the fees that he'll have to pay to the state, for tearing it down, were going to be less than the cost of unrest. People could get hurt. People would continue to protest. The police would have to continue to be out there. It's just cheaper to take it down, and no one gets, in trouble in the meantime. And it's already become a gathering spot for fascist sympathizers, right? These are some of the people that worked with the Park District on that renewal fundraising effort, right? And yes, we will be thoroughly Googling all of these people, find out where their sympathies lie on other topics. Some of the people who defended this are starting to pass away. We quoted Dominic DeFrisco before. He led this joint civic committee of Italian Americans, which continues to peddle falsehoods about Balbo, Columbus, probably others. Don Fiore, columnist for this Italian American newsletter here in Chicago, Fra Noi. And in a lot of ways, these revisionists, not very different than Mussolini's quest to glorify the Roman Empire and diminish the history of the Roman Republic, right? It's sort of in the DNA of fascism to, glorify militarism, to glorify racism, and to modify history to those ends, to modify, what public statues honor towards those ends. So some of the challenges to changing this, one is Aldermanic Perogative, which, in 2017, there were several aldermen who spoke out and said that they thought it was time to change the name of the street and to take down the monument, but because it wasn't their ward, it was considered rude of them to interfere. This has historically been a policy that has been used to kind of keep the city segregated. Aldermen could block projects like affordable housing in their ward. Under Mayor Lightfoot, some changes have been made, but it's still, I feel, an obstacle towards this. We really need the two aldermen whose wards the street is in to give their thumbs up on changing it. And a lot of people feel like, well, aren't other issues more pressing? Aldermen, they run for office because they care about jobs and education, not really street names. They don't want to risk their political capital on, a couple of blocks that are named after someone that most people have forgotten. Activists with Black Lives Matter, they're more focused on policing and prisons. But I think, as I highlighted, there's money that's going towards this already, right? Money that could be going towards more progressive issues, right? And removing these monuments is as much about the people calling for change as it is about the statues themselves, like I quoted earlier. So, steps we can take. Have a little phone script here. And, you know, Neo picking up the phone, say, "Hi, my name is, and I'm calling to ask you to rename Balbo Drive and take down the monument to fascism." Simple thing. You can do it. You can find your alderman. You can go to this link, tinyurl.com/Chicago Alderman List. It'll give you, you know, a way to find your alderman's phone number and email. These are the aldermen with the street in their ward. Sophia King for the 4th Ward. Have her email there. Have her phone number. This is the map of her ward. So you can see Balbo Drive is like at the north end there. Brendan Riley, 42nd Ward. That's his phone number. That's his email. And that's a map of his ward. And you can see it's Balbo is on the southern part of the map there. You can call the Chicago Park District. You can email them. Got their phone number there. You know, I mean, just think. Your kids use the Park District. Right now, money is going towards essentially fascists that could be going towards your kids having quality programming. We can educate people, talk to community groups, churches, Italian organizations, elected officials in Italy, Ethiopian and Libyan organizations here in Chicago, unions, historians, and you know, other elected officials, state reps, and so forth. We can protest. I'll tell you right now, July 15th, it's the anniversary of Balbo's Landing. We're going to have a protest at this column. We're going to gather, we're going to have signs, we're going to speak out and call on the city to do the right thing and to rename the street and to put the column in a museum. We can also, you know, if we want to get more creative, take direct action. A good example of this. Back in the 60s, the Black Panther Party, they had this issue where children were being injured crossing this street in Oakland. The city refused to install a stoplight, so the Black Panthers organized crossing guards and used that to pressure the city into building some stoplights. And today, there's this sign at that intersection at 55th and Market in Oakland. You can see it says August 1st, 1967. This stoplight was installed as a result of a community initiative spearheaded by the Black Panther Party. There was also, here in Chicago, this protest in 2003, change, C-H-A, change to chaos. And it was an art protest against the privatization of Chicago public housing, the Chicago Housing Authority. You can see in this photo, activists wore city worker yellow vests and replaced some of these posters that CHA had put up to kind of promote this privatization effort. They replaced them with their own posters. And then they sent a press release, Yes Men style, out kind of claiming, oh, you know, the CHA is changing its you know, what we're doing. So you can see they're replacing the one sign in the bus shelter with the other. This is like the original one, and then the new one. You know, the new one, it says, "Do developers deserve a tax break more than you do?" So, yeah, I don't know if people are really able to comment on this live stream. I don't know if we have too many people still watching. Well, I'll give people a minute in case they want to post any questions in the comments, and I can respond to them But yeah, we're at about the hour mark, so. Okay. Doesn't look like we have any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and end this. And, you know, this is the first time I did this. We'll probably do it again. You know, a little practice makes perfect. Continually revising the PowerPoint and working on the live streaming setup. So thanks for watching, especially if you made it all the way to the end. And, you know, let's keep up the struggle, keep up the action. Oh, okay, I see a comment. Thank you, Brad, for watching all of this. And, you know, onwards.